Greetings everyone, my name is Michael McCann, and welcome to another Wayward Art Company video using Blender and mask tools. And in this video I'll be demonstrating how I created this forest temple with the newest release of Mask Tools 1.9. Now if you don't know what Mask Tools is, it's an add-on available for Blender that adds professional style texturing techniques and works in a layer-based system. Now for this project, I'll be primarily using the mask base node, which is the fundamental node that you'll likely use the most in texturing any model. However, after downloading the add-on, you'll have access to this PDF that has information on all of the additional nodes and their functionality. Now to start, I'll be using this very simple model, but it has been subdivided a few times because I will be using some material displacement at the end. Here I have some textures available that I'll be using for this project. And I also want to split the screen so that I have access to the shader editor. There you'll find all of the options for mask tools. So if I switch the 3D view to the shader editor and click new to add a new material, now I can just delete this principled BSDF. And then in the sidebar, I can click on the mask tools tab where I have all of these different node options. And you'll notice that there are two separate mask-based nodes. One of them is a light version that will be a little faster and might perform a little better. This also applies to the presets, but I'm going to select the full version of that preset so that I have all of those additional options available. Now you'll notice in this new version, the nodes now stay connected to the mouse until you release them by clicking. Okay, so I'm going to turn off the overlays and go into rendered view. And we'll start to see this very generic material applied because we haven't added any textures to it yet. So let's go to the very first node in the node setup. And I will start by adding the stone wall texture. So I can just select these textures and drag them right into the shader editor and then connect them to their corresponding inputs. Now, just like with the principled shader, any texture that isn't adding color information needs to be set to non-color data. So I'll minimize these textures to make some more room. Now I'll add the normal map texture, again set this to non-color data, connect it to the normal input, and finally I'll add the displacement texture. And we want the option to scale these textures, so I'm going to select one node and type Ctrl-T. This is with the Node Wrangler add-on enabled. And I can connect this mapping node to all of these textures, and this will allow me to scale the texture to the size that I like. Okay, so that looks all right. To keep everything nice and organized, I'm going to select these nodes and type Ctrl-G. This will turn this into a node group, but I want to add the scale to the group input. This will still allow me to scale these textures even after they're in a nice organized group. And if you wish to, you can name these groups. I'll just call this one stone. Okay, so now we have this second set of texture inputs that we need to add something to. Now, obviously, I'm using a little bit of artistic freedom here because obviously concrete was not available to the pre-Columbian or Mayans for building their temples. But I like this texture in particular because it matches the color very well to that stone wall texture. Now, we won't actually see this concrete texture applied until we add our mask. So what I'm going to do is the same thing I did with the stone wall texture. I'll add a mapping node and I'll connect all of these inputs to it. And then I'll turn it into a group. And then just add that scale option to the group input. So now later on, after adding the mask, I'll be able to scale that texture to a size that I think looks good. Now, right here in the center, we have this mask input, and for that we need a texture node. So I'll type Shift-A and add a texture, image texture, and then click New, and I'll call this Temple Detail. And for the size, I'll just multiply this by 4, which will take it to 4096 by 4096, and then I'll click the 32-bit float checkbox. Now I'll plug this into the mask input, and with this texture selected, I will go to the Texture Paint tab. And here we have the model visible and the image in the image editor. So you'll notice that you can see the UVs. If I tab into edit mode and I deselect these faces, then the UVs disappear. So you want to make sure that everything is selected. But I want to change the setup a bit here, so I'm going to split this window and change the bottom one from the 3D viewport to the image editor and switch from view to paint. Now if I select that texture, I'll be able to view it in that image editor. Okay, and for the large window to the left, I'm going to switch that to the shader editor because I want all of the options from those mask-based nodes. Okay, now before painting, I will once again go to the rendered view and turn off the overlays. Okay, so if I increase my brush size with the F key, I can just start painting this concrete texture directly on the model, and you can see that being applied to the image below as well. Now I can come over to the mask-based node and start adding some of these effects. For instance, I can add bump mapping. And since I can now see the concrete texture, I can adjust the scaling. And this is really one of the benefits of painting with masks, is that you can still scale the textures even after painting them. So let's take a look at some of the other features on the mask-based node. To do that, I'm going to disconnect the color socket for that concrete, because again, it's so similar to the stone wall texture. I really want this to be visible during the demonstration. We can, however, still see the normal and roughness map applied to this material. Now, the mask-based node gives you plenty of options for blending materials, which is really crucial in creating really complex materials. There is the option to blend the normal maps, and of course, lower and increase the bump effect. I can blend the color of those two textures, and with an additional slider, if I were to say add a darker value to the second color input, I can choose between adding the lighter values of that texture or the darker values of that texture. Now these are just ways of blending the color and the height information, but there are separate options for customizing the mask itself. Now this mask blend option will control the blend between these two material types. Now, while it will always preserve the height information, you can control how sharp the transition is between those two materials. And if you lower this value slider, then you will blend these materials all the way down until only the height information is visible. Next, we have the mask shape slider, which will do exactly as the name implies. It will either tighten up the mask or it will give it these nice rounded edges. Next, we have the Add Mask Value slider, which could be used to sort of fake some ambient occlusion, or it can be used to show different levels of height. And we'll be using this a little bit later on in this video. But just as a side note, how much of this dark edge is visible is heavily impacted by the mask blend and the mask shape sliders. And of course, I should have mentioned that you can invert the bump mapping too, which is also very useful. Now, there are more features on the mask-based node that we will go over later in the video, but I want to take a moment to cover some of the new features of mask tools in version 1.9. Now, if I move my mask out and then type N to bring up the side panel, click on Mask Tools, and then open the options, this entire third row are distortion filters. Now, if I select one of these and then click Add Filter, I can drop this directly into the line feeding into the mask input. In previous versions of Mask Tools, this had its own separate input, but now it's much more convenient this way. With these distortion filters, you can add various types of noise to your brush. Either while you paint or after you paint, you can still adjust these distortion effects. This allows you to really easily paint these grungy elements onto your model, and they use the infinite resolution of these procedural textures, so the height map or the height information will be really highly detailed. A new feature to these nodes is the Edge Only slider, which preserves the majority of the mask but only distorts the edges. And just as a side note, the border mask has also been added as simply just a filter. It used to be a node of its own, but now if we select the border mask and add it, we can just drop it again directly into the line leading into the mask input. And there are so many uses for the border mask node, I'll probably make an entire video just on this node in particular. But I wanted to show you that it still has all of the same features as before. You can add noise, you can change the shape. And it just now works just as a distortion filter, so it can be very useful and easy to use. And just sort of as an additional side note, all of these distortion filters and the distortion filters combined with border masks can actually work together. So just to show a quick example, we'll move these nodes out and we'll open up the Mask Tools options. We'll select another one of these noise distortion filters. We'll drop it into the line after the border mask. And you can see what it's doing is just distorting the border. So it can give you like an additional type of noise added to that border. However, the order of these nodes does matter. So if I just select these two nodes and I reverse them and then reconnect them, now you can see that the border mask is actually searching for the edges of all of that distorted noise. So again, the order of these nodes really do matter, but in conjunction with each other, you can actually create some really interesting and beautiful effects. Now there's one other point I would like to make about the mask blend option that will be particularly useful in this video. Now, if I just draw these lines and gradually decrease the value of that mask, you'll see two things happening. First, you'll see the strength of that bump decreasing, and secondly, you'll actually see these two materials start to blend together. Now, this can be very useful if you want to control how these materials blend together. However, by increasing the mask blend slider, you will be essentially separating those two materials completely, but still preserving that bump map. And I know I'm repeating myself a little bit here, but this is pretty crucial to how I'm going to create this forest temple with all of the various height information. So if I set that value to black, I can just erase all of that mask. And now what I want to do instead is add some stencils, some texture information that I'm going to download from textures.com. And this website has some really wonderful stencils that can be used. If I click on 3D ornaments and then scroll down to pre-Columbian, here I have like an assortment of different textures that I can use for this project. So if you click on one of these groups, if you have a free account, you'll be able to download 3 of these per day, because each one is 5 credits. You get 15 credits per day, which is quite generous, I think. So if I click on the Textures tab in the Properties window and then click New Texture, I can navigate to the folder that I keep those textures in and select one. Alright, and I'm going to be using this texture as a stencil. So in order to set that up, I'm going to go back to my Texture Paint settings, and I'll switch the blend type from mix to add, and that will prevent me from painting any of the darker values from that texture onto the model. Next, if I click on texture, it'll show all of the options. We can see the texture available, and I want to switch the mapping to stencil. And once you do that, you can see the stencil visible in both the image editor and the 3D viewport. Now here at the top, I can click on this face mask selection tool and then double tap A to mask out all of those faces. And then the C key will turn on the selection tool. So now I can just select all of the faces that I want to paint on. Okay, and if you accidentally select faces that you don't wish to paint on, then you can use the middle mouse key to deselect them. To move the stencil, you just right-click and drag, and to scale you can hold Shift and right-click, and that will make the texture larger or smaller. And once you have the stencil in place, you can just start painting, but first I want to go back to my texture paint options and scroll down to symmetry. And I'm going to turn on the Y symmetry, and now when I paint on the front of this model, it will also appear on the back as well. Okay, so now I'm just using this stencil to apply this mask, and now that it is applied, I can actually reconnect that the color map from that concrete texture. Okay, so that looks pretty good. I'm going to hit 3 on the number pad, which will take me into the side view. And I'll line that stencil up the same way that I did for the front view. And I can turn off the Y symmetry and turn on the X symmetry so that when I paint this on the right side, it will also appear on the left side of the model as well. Alright, so now we have this mask applied to all 4 sides of the model. You'll also notice that the only UVs that are visible in the image editor are of the ones that I have selected in the 3D viewport. And you'll notice that in the image editor, if you look at this mask, you can see a lot of different ranges of value. So this is where the Add Mask Value slider comes in handy. If you slide this all the way up, you'll notice that the higher parts seem very bright and the lower parts seem very dark. Now this seems a bit extreme, so I'll dial this back to maybe a 0.5. And the purpose of this is just to accent the variation in that height information. Okay, so I want to add more detail to this temple, and I have already downloaded multiple textures from textures.com. And I'm going to speed through this section because it's essentially me just doing the same thing over and over, just selecting different stencils and then painting them on different parts of the model. And for this next step, because the base of the temple is scaled out, it would be very difficult to paint a stencil on the model itself. So instead, I'm going to use the selection tool and select these faces that I want to paint on, and then just paint directly on the UVs in the image editor. Okay, so this is looking pretty good, but there's still a little more that I want to demonstrate with the concept of painting in values. Okay, so I want to select another texture, and it will be another from that pre-Columbian set, and this is a seamless texture. But before painting that onto the model, I want to first add an underlying portion of this mask. Just to show you what I mean, I'll click on the Fill tool, and I'll lower the value to make it a little gray. And then by using the Face Mask Selection tool, I'll select only the faces that I want to paint on, and then fill those faces with that gray value. So now if I go back to the paintbrush, I can start painting that new texture on the model. And just as I did with the fill tool, I'm going to decrease the value so that I'm not painting in a value of pure white. And next I will change the mapping to view plane and turn off the symmetry for both the X and the Y, and then change the stroke method to line. It's also important to change the spacing from 10% to 100% because you want to show 100% of the texture. And then I'll change the fall off to a very hard fall off, just so that there's no blending at the edges of the texture. So once you've changed your stroke method to line, it's easier to paint in the image editor, provided that your UVs are organized. So I'm going to scale my brush down with the F key, and I'll start at one point, and I'll use the mouse just to click and drag all the way to the end, and then release, and then you have this texture applied. But I'm going to use Control Z to undo that, and then lower the value a bit more, because I feel like that's a bit too bright. I'm keeping in mind the displacement value that we'll be using for the material displacement at the end. And that looks quite a bit better, so I'll just continue painting this seamless texture along the top portion of this model on all four sides. Okay, so I think this is enough detail for the first mask-based node. Considering all of this has just come from one of the four nodes in the timeline of the mask-based preset. And you'll also notice that all of this texture information is being outputted into the second mask-based node. Now, ordinarily I would want to create a new mask, but in this case I want to use the mask of the previous mask-based node. So there is a mask output which I will use. And you can see that that overrides all of that concrete texture. And the reason I'm doing this is because I want to discuss another feature on the mask-based nodes that we haven't yet covered, at least in this video, called contrast overlay. But first I want to select this preset material of gold. Now the preset materials in mask tools have all of the outputs that you would find in image textures from whichever texture website that you download your textures from. The only exception is that there is no normal map, so instead there is a bump output that can be plugged into the material bump input, which is a new input for the mask-based node in version 1.9. And this is pretty significant because it means that you can now use your own procedural textures that you've created for mask tools. And these procedural materials that come with mask tools come with a variety of ways of customizing their look regarding their color or color value, their roughness, or their bump strength, etc. So after I'm satisfied with the way that I've customized this material, I want to go back to the mask-based node and use a feature that we've talked about in previous videos called the contrast overlay. Now if I turn the contrast overlay on and then slide the adjust overlay up, I can start to bring some of that texture back. And ultimately what it's doing is it's subtracting all of the darkest values from that texture, so only leaving the brightest value. And so now we have this painted gold effect, which looks really nice. And because the contrast overlay subtracts the darkest values, it can be especially useful for creating these worn painted wood effects. And there's an invert overlay effect that allows you to do the same thing for a brick texture. Alright, so now let's move to the third mask-based node in the timeline. And what I would like to do now is to start creating some grungy aging effects to make this temple look a little worn. So I'll start by adding this dirt material to the mask base node, and then rather than painting this on, we can take a look at some of the procedural masks that come with mask tools. Okay, so this second row of node options are procedural masks, and they all have various different effects that will be applied to a model. So I want to add the Z grunge, and I'll connect that into the mask input. And now we can see that effect applied. And there are many options here for controlling the position or the scale, even the contrast. But you might start to feel a little bit of lag right now. So what I'm going to do is use Control Shift and left click on that mask base node to just view the color. Here the performance will increase quite considerably. And I do get many questions from users about the lag or performance of mask tools in Blender. And version 1.9 has considerable improvements. But the reality is that Blender is not meant to handle this many textures in one material view. So whereas other texturing softwares are programmed specifically for that. Again, though, version 1.9 has some massive improvements, and it just continues to get better with more development. So I think I have the Z mask looking okay. I just wanted to create that accumulation of dirt around the base of the temple. But let's add another procedural mask. Let's add the leaking mask. And we don't need to start a new mask base node for this. Each procedural mask has a combine mask input. So we can just connect it right into that combine mask input on the Z grunge. And we've now combined these two masks together. Now I'll turn on the Z mask and I'll turn on starting point, which makes the mask disappear. But if you use the adjust starting point, you can basically control where the leaking begins. And I want it to start right underneath of that ledge. All right, and just as with the Z grunge mask, there are several options for scaling and adjusting position, contrast, and so on. So now I'm at the final mask base node in this mask base preset. And of course you can always add more mask base nodes or use less depending on what your project needs. But to further that illusion that it's overgrown and like aged with dirt and other elements, I want to add some moss. And I'll be using another procedural mask to do that. So right now I've just added the color and the roughness map. Now there is a normal map texture that comes with this material. But I don't want to use it because I will be using some heavy bump detail. And so ultimately you wouldn't see the normal map anyway. So I'll just add these two textures to a group, and then of course add the scale to the material input so that I can still change the scale of it if I wish. Alright, so now I'll go back to the mask tools options. And I will select, there are two different kinds of grunges here. There's a grunge noise and a grunge deform. I want to use the grunge deform because it has more of an organic pattern to it. And once I connect that to the mask input, we'll see that effect on the model. And remember that in addition to all of the options on that procedural mask, there are also those options on the mask base node, like the mask blend and the mask shape and so on. And so these options will also impact how these procedural masks appear. And now that I've added all of the materials that I want to add to this model, I'm going to go into the Cycles render engine and switch from CPU to GPU, and then check the little denoise box, and that will make the viewport really responsive. And the reason that we're in Cycles is because we want to use the material displacement features, which are only available in Cycles. Next, I want to give this a subdivision surface modifier and increase the levels to 6 for both the viewport and the render. And before we actually add the displacement, let's take a look at the material shader node that all of those mask base nodes are connected to. And by using Control-Shift-Click, you can scroll down through the various maps and make adjustments to those individual textures. So the color texture, for instance, if I wanted to add ambient occlusion, I can just view it this way. Of course, there is an ambient occlusion output, so if you wanted to just bake that texture separately, you could as well. But I'm going to continue scrolling down through these maps with Control-Shift-Click because I want to view the displacement. And if something looks a bit off about that, that's because of all of these mask-based nodes, we only have displacement textures plugged into 2 inputs, which are on the first mask-based node. And the way to solve that is if any material is not using displacement, you need to use the displacement output from the previous node and just connect them into those inputs. Once that's done, all of those materials will have height information, but there's still one more thing to do. I want to go back to the first mask-based node and use the Add Mask to Height slider. Now, just as that mask added bump detail, it will also add a displacement detail. And you can use that value slider to adjust the strength of that effect. And then finally, on the very last node, which is the material shader node, there are separate options for displacement. So there's the displacement scale, the brightness, the contrast. What I would like to do is actually lower the contrast a bit just to even out the balance of some of those values. Of course, it will be easier to make those adjustments once we've added the displacement. So let's do that. Let's go to the material setting in the properties window. Then under settings, next to displacement, we'll switch this from bump only to displacement only. Now we'll connect this displacement socket into the material output displacement. And there you go, we have this very highly detailed temple now. Something that would have been very challenging to model or even to sculpt was done in a very short time just by using textures. From this point, you could bake out all of those individual textures, including the height map, to use in Eevee. Now, we're not going to do that in this video. We have done it in previous videos, so if you're not really familiar with the baking process, you can go back and check out those videos, but I will also be doing more in the future where we cover more of the baking process. I also have some other videos I'm planning to record just to demonstrate some of the new features in version 1.9. There's still so much to cover. But that's it for this video. Thanks to everybody who has supported Mask Tools and just my channel here. I'm grateful for all of it, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you for watching.